In this lecture, we examine the philosophy of Giovanni Battista Vico, in particular his New Science, a New Science of History, which in many ways was the founding document or founding work in the modern philosophy of history. But it was also a profoundly important critique of critical philosophy itself. Now, Vico was, in his own lifetime, a fairly obscure figure, a professor of rhetoric at Naples, but his philosophy of history had an immense influence in the 19th and 20th centuries. And in many ways we'll see that Vico's New Science occupies an extremely curious place in the normal trajectory of 18th century intellectual history. The early Enlightenment was characterized by a commitment to a naturalistic metaphysic. Such a metaphysic looked to science as the means to all rational and reliable knowledge. And the hero figure of this movement was obviously Sir Isaac Newton. And he was heralded as having successfully discovered at least some of the principal laws of nature. Following that breakthrough, the next task was obviously to apply the same scientific method to understanding man, society, politics, and history. And this was attempted in a variety of different ways, often by a study of the laws of human nature or psychology. We see this in Spinoza and to some extent in Hobbes. It was sometimes formulated through social contractarianism, again, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. And in some cases by a study of the laws of historical causation, which were first raised in some ways by Machiavelli, and then you'll see developed to some extent by Montesquieu. Vico, however, combined both of these approaches, the psychological insight as well as the historical one. And what he offered was, in fact, an evolutionary interpretation of human history, one not based on direct nomothesis, but rather on the sort of development associated in the 19th century with Hegel, and then later in the natural world with Darwin. So on the one hand, Vico's analysis of history really does fulfill the Enlightenment's project of a science of man, and a science based on an empirical study of psychology, society, politics, and culture. But on the other hand, Vico's science was obviously intended not as a celebration of Enlightenment naturalism, but instead as a warning against its central tendencies. And it thus turned Enlightenment criticism against itself. And in that way, one might argue that Vico is in fact a modern anti-modern. Now, while he was obscure in his own lifetime, his work became rediscovered in the 19th century, where he was widely heralded as a precursor to Hegel and other influential contemporary philosophers of history, and has remained an important figure all the way up to the 20th century. Figures like Isaiah Berlin have drawn great inspiration from Vico's work, and those who have read James Joyce, in particular Finnegan's Wake, will recognize it is a massive and extended fictional representation of Vico's theory of corso and ricorso, the course and recourse of history and institutions. So I want you to keep this in mind as we examine Vico, that Vico is in this way being a ridge rider. He's deploying the techniques of the Enlightenment against its central metaphysical, moral, and epistemological positions. And it's with epistemology that I want to begin, because after Descartes, and in many ways Vico is responding more than anyone to Descartes, the epistemological status of history had been placed in jeopardy. We recall that Descartes' epistemology was based on that of clear and distinct ideas. Such an epistemology precluded any possibility of scientific history, because science is not axiomatic, it's not like geometry. Historical terms can't be rigorously defined, nor can history be subject to experiment. So if you take the Cartesian model of science, history becomes something which we cannot really have reliable or certain knowledge of. Now, Vico responded to this criticism, and particular to the principle of cogito ergo sum, which supported this epistemological doctrine of clear and distinct ideas, a doctrine of certainty based on intuitive and unreflective clarity and distinction. And it was the fact that it was intuitive and unreflective that allowed Vico at least to argue that such sorts of arguments were in fact sub-scientific. Clarity and distinction only applied to mathematics as criterion of truth. And that's precisely because mathematical ideas are our own conceptual inventions. So he argues for his other principle here, which he calls verum factum. We know what we make. We know the truth about matters that we have cognitively constructed or invented. And it's for that reason that we're able to have, according to Vico, the sort of knowledge and certainty of mathematics that we can, and the reason that we can only get a practical certainty in scientific matters because we didn't create nature. But in this case, what we find is that history, then, is something which should be subject to that sort of certain scientific knowledge, precisely because history is made by man, at least in part. So therefore, history can be a science, and it's that new science which we're going to examine in the rest of this lecture. We begin with what Vico calls the course of history. Roughly speaking, Vico held to a cyclical theory of history. It's worth noting at the beginning that Vico's cyclical theory of history applies only to post-Diluvian Gentile nations, which is to say, Vico ultimately is a fairly orthodox and pious Catholic, one of the reasons that he rejects the Enlightenment. And so his philosophy of history doesn't apply to the ancient Hebrews who had direct contact with God. And therefore their course of history is definable by direct divine intervention, as opposed to the sort of law-like development, which Vico will ultimately argue is also the result of God, but God working through secondary courses in his providential design. Okay. Such a claim will hold, or such a cyclical theory will hold, that nations and cultures and civilizations go through certain definable stages. But there is no eternal return in Vico's doctrine, which is to say that the ancient Romans had also believed in cyclical theories of history. In fact, most non-Judeo-Christian peoples have always believed in cyclical theories of history. But they had also often argued for eternal return, which is to say that everything just repeats itself. Vico thought that there was, in fact, development towards truth between cycles. So we'll find that Vico is arguing that nations undergo this common course of development, which we'll see is made of exactly 3 stages, each of which represents a distinct level not only of political and social organization, but also of cultural activity, and more than anything, of consciousness, that the mind of man changes. The way he thinks and understands his universe changes in different epochs. So the mentality and institutions that typify a particular stage of development will be preserved among the new institutions and mentalities that develop in the later stages. And we'll see as well that the mechanism that moves cultures through these stages turns out ultimately to be class struggle, and in this way Vico is an important precursor to Marx. Each stage is therefore increasingly popular and humanistic, and when the cycle has run its course, the civilization in question undergoes dissolution. It is either conquered from without or collapses from within, and the whole process begins again, and we'll see that's called the recourse of institutions. Okay. The primary focus of Vico's study is, in fact, to a lesser extent, Hellenic classical Greece, but primarily the history of ancient Rome. In part, this is a result of the wealth of sources available to him on Rome, but it's also due, I think, in part at least, to its affiliation with modern Europe. Rome was the founding parent state for modern Western European culture, and in many ways the Roman example was a great inspiration for people in the 18th century. So Vico will hold that Roman history is typical, not in the sense that every nation is exactly like Rome, but that Rome is an archetype, and that in the right conditions every nation would follow the trajectory of Rome in its course of development, if not for outside influences. And this means that Vico is going to employ new methods of analyses, methods coming from philology, which will be an important source subsequently for Nietzsche, the study of languages, but also a sort of empathetic understanding of ancient cultures based on archaeological and literary sources, which very much inform our contemporary practice of anthropology. So the first stage, the first of these ages of development, Vico calls the age of gods. And here he's really responding, I think, quite powerfully to the social contractarianism that one would find in Hobbes and Locke, where they had argued that man in his natural state is the same rational creature we find in his socialized state. He's simply alienated and isolated, and therefore forms contracts to create government and society. Vico, I think, much more realistically argues that natural man is indeed primitive. And primitive man is, by nature, beastly. And therefore, his consciousness is likely to be extremely limited and his rationality highly impaired. The first breakthrough to history, according to Vico, is the establishment of the family state. In the most primitive state, post-Diluvian Gentiles simply acted like animals, procreating wildly and leaving their progeny to fend for themselves after they had reached a fairly young age. What creates the first family state is that such people are filled with superstition and fear, and assume that natural forces are informed by divine agencies. Thus, when in the fields mating with their women, they hear thunder and lightning, and associate that with the divine anger of the gods. And that produces in them a sense of shame and fear. And they suspect that the gods disapprove of their promiscuity. They therefore take particular women to their caves for shelter, and therefore we find the emergence of the first sanctified marriages, the first basic institution of society and of historical development. Now, as I've mentioned, these men believe in a primitive anthropomorphic interpretation of the gods, one that's associated with natural forces expressing the anger of gods. So the first gods are, in fact, for Vico, storm gods, like Jove, or Zeus, Marduk in Babylon, Indra in the subcontinent of Asia, and we could replicate the number of these thunder gods ad infinitum. The thunderbolt for these ancient peoples is a message and a command. And this suggests that the principal form of wisdom of these first men in the age of gods is augury, the reading of signs in nature and, of course, in animals. And the Romans, of course, were quite famous for the practice of augury, reading the future of battles in the disposition of internal organs that they would dissect out of a bird, usually. In such an organization, the ancient family in the age of gods is intensely patriarchal. The father is the king, the judge, and the priest of these first proto-societies, who has an absolute power and dominion over all members of the family. Three principles support this stage. The first is religion, the belief in divine agency. The second is marriage, marriages that are sanctified under the gods, that the gods have approved of. And the third is the burial of the dead, because it is the burial of the dead, which clearly has religious implications, which first creates private property. Once one buries one's dead, one is marking that area as sacred ground, as ground only occupiable by that particular family. Well, it's important to note that this age of gods is no golden age. The mentality of man is crude, and what little order exists within the family is the result of frightful religions and remarkably cruel and harsh severity. The mentality of this epoch is crudely physical. There's little in the way of rationality or imagination. It's based on sense. Signs, as I've suggested, are seen in nature. Nature is literally telling us a story. The heavens and all things are divine auspices, showing us the will of the gods. And the obedience of the patriarch in the family state is important because it prepares people to live in an orderly fashion, and therefore gives us the sort of psychological predisposition that allows for the emergence of the city-state. Well, the next age of man, Vico calls the age of heroes. Not all men found themselves in caves in primitive family states. Some of the post-Diluvian Gentiles continued to wander aimlessly, practicing their bestial life, having sex promiscuously, and attacking all their fellows without distinction. And therefore they fall into two groups, the hunted and the hunters. The hunted, the weaker ones, seek refuge from their more violent fellows in the clearings or asylums of the patriarchs, those fields that have been established around the buried ancestors of those families. These patriarchs organize themselves together in a coalition to kill off the other class of primitives, the violent marauders. The refugees now become the clients or famulae of the patriarchs. And here we see the beginning of subordination between what were once primitives who have now become serfs. Well, these clearings, these asylums, become the first villages, where the patriarch is still the king, father, and priest of his family, tribe, or clan, and the refugees are put to work on the land, which is owned exclusively by the patriarchs. It's important to note that not only have they no property rights, but these refugees also are not allowed any sacred marriages, precisely because they don't share the religions of the fathers, the patriarchs, who therefore don't recognize their marriages as sacred, and therefore they are illegitimate. Hence, they are unable to have patrimony, which is to say legitimate lines of descent within their families, and therefore cannot transmit property to their young. After the land is settled, at some point, Vico argues, the refugees, the serfs, rebel. And they are, in that rebellion, they are ultimately pacified by an agrarian law, which reduces them from the sort of proto-slavery they were in into a more serf-like peasantry. And the social order of this age is therefore feudal. In this growing class struggle between the serfs and the lords, who are clearly the proto-aristocrats, the aristocrats will unite against the refugees and create what Vico calls heroic or aristocratic commonwealths, which he thinks are the basis of most of the ancient Greek city-states. And they are to be found in pre-Republican Rome as well as in Homeric Greece. In such states, the heroes are in fact the only magistrates and priests. They now consider themselves heroes or sons of the gods and make up a new patrician order, as it will become called, coming from the fact that they are patriarchs, against these serfs who will now become known in Rome as plebeians. Now, the human nature of this epic, of this heroic age, is proud and magnanimous, very much the characters represented by figures like Hercules, Achilles, and even, to some extent, Aeneas. The law is based on exactly worded agreements rather than auspices. The rule continues to be severe, but the goal of this rule is no longer based on superstition, but is now based on the desire for comfort. The mentality of this age is characterized by imagination, what Vico calls poetic wisdom, what we might call poetic creativity at the outset. And this, of course, is a way of expressing the fact that this is the moment of great epic poetry. Over time, however, such a mentality moves more towards a practical rationality, and this we witness in the rise of early Greek philosophy and in the rationalization of legal mores in Rome. The emergence of therefore, of the city-state represents ultimately the sort of rise of a true nation or civilization. It is at this point that man has recovered from his true primitivism and is becoming a truly civilized being. And this ushers in the third age, the age of man. Slowly but surely, Vico argues, the plebeians continue to fight for their rights. This goes through three stages, essentially. And of course, this is modeled on the famous struggles of the orders between the plebeians and patricians in Rome. In the first stage, the plebeians insist on the right to have solemnized marriages, that their marriages be recognized as legitimate. And this, of course, is a difficult and violent struggle, and it is only when they threaten to withhold both their labor and military services that the patricians are forced to give way and finally allow for the sacralization and solemnization of plebeian marriages, which will ultimately result in laws permitting intermarriage between the social orders. The next demand of the plebeians is the right of citizenship, the right to vote, the right to have some say and voice in the government. And this obviously is represented in the emergence of the plebiscita, the vote for the plebes, and of course their representative figures, the tribunes, who are the leaders of the plebes. Finally, the ultimate stage in this development is the acquiring of the right to hold office in the state by plebeians and commoners. And it's at this point which we see the full emergence of the so-called democratic republican city-state. Now, Vico calls this an age of men because it is only in this stage that civilization recognizes human equality, and a human equality based on reason and shared rationality rather than shared religious tradition and custom. So old traditional laws, which were based on auspices and interpretations of divine will, are now refined and redefined as, quote, natural laws, as laws based purely on reason. So legal and political institutions become rationalized, naturalized, and more than anything, humanized and universalized. It's also at this moment that high cultural institutions or academies reach their zenith, and where philosophy makes its emergence as a powerful and important form of cultural knowledge, doctrine, and inspiration. This process obviously culminates in the rise of democratic republics, and it's facilitated by the development of various character types among the rulers. Vico here holds that, in fact, such institutions are democratic republican institutions, while the very flower of civilization are inherently unstable and create changes in mentalities themselves among the rulers. So the first of these rulers in the age of men are valorous and just folks, people like Scipio Africanus or Pericles in Greece, who really opened the way, paved the road, as it were, to popular liberty. And for Vico, this represents the development of the nation towards a more full and rich equality. The nature of such rulers is, in fact, benign, as is the human nature of that moment. They represent that human nature. But such liberty, popular liberty, like democracy, is for Vico always inherently unstable and always leads to growing internal division and civil war, because people cease to become loyal to the state and become increasingly self-interested and interested in their own agendas. This leads to the growth of social factions and to the famous civil wars which racked Rome and, in fact, all of late Hellenic Greece. This leads to the second type of rulers, ambitious and great figures who will establish universal monarchies which nonetheless will retain the republican forms of law which allow people to pursue self-interest and allow the government of the state to take care of itself. Representative figures here, the ambitious and great, would be Alexander from Macedon, and of course Julius and Augustus Caesar, who bring order back to the disrupted civil war-racked city-state in the form of monarchies, but monarchies that are associated with civil rights. And this represents the sort of highest maturity of the political culture. It's after this point that things really begin to go downhill. Monarchies are firmly established by reflective and melancholy types like Tiberius, who represent the growing delicacy of the culture's nature as it drops its severity and its harshness and becomes more and more effete. These are, in fact, ultimately destroyed by dissolute madmen, whose delicacy produces insanity in figures like Nero or Caligula. Overall, the mentality of this epoch is characterized by reason or rationality, but eventually reason itself becomes purely skeptical and critical. And in so doing, it undermines the social bonds that are created by religion and tradition. And this is Vico's deep critique of the Enlightenment, that once reason becomes skeptical and critical and eliminates, quote, superstition, it eliminates the very glue which had created social solidarity and allowed the emergence of civilization in the first place. The result is, with the dissolution of such religious bonds, the poetic wisdom of tradition from the age of heroes, we find nothing so much as a barren intellectualism taking its place. Similarly, legal and social humanism become accompanied by a growing social and legal decadence and a concern for purely private interests and concerns. Ultimately, the society either disintegrates from within and collapses, or it is overrun from without because it lacks that social glue and cohesion which is necessary for military self-protection. And the result is a new barbarism. Right? The cycle has completed itself. Well, it's at this point that we turn to the next stage. That's the course of history. It's followed by the recourse of institutions in the second barbarism. That the process will replicate itself with similar ages, but there will be some development toward the truth. So once a culture and nation has run its course, it'll continue to degenerate until it can recover that religious and primal spontaneity of the primitive mind, right? Because it's that which allows the reemergence of the whole cycle, the course of history. And that is always expressed, that primitive spontaneity, as contact with God or divine providence. And it's at that moment that the whole process can begin again. So, as Vico argues quite briefly, after Rome disintegrated and was overrun by Germanic barbarians, the early Christian church heralded a new age of gods among Europeans, both with its auguries, and if we think about the early church, its cult of relics and saints and prophecies clearly are in some way similar to the auguries of the ancient Romans. And then the next stage, of course, is the age of heroes, which Vico finds in medieval Europe. Right? The feudal social order corresponds to that feudal social order found in ancient Mycenaean Greece, the Greece of the Homeric heroes. A society dominated by heroic aristocrats, in this case, the chivalrous knights, who are again differentiated by their predecessors in the ancient world by being Christian, and in this sense there has been progress between the ages. Our understanding of the divine becomes more and more accurate, more and more true. Finally, the rise of absolute monarchy in the 18th century and the age of reason and philosophy herald our next age of man in Europe. And clearly, the rise of skeptical philosophies in figures like Bayle, Pascal, Descartes, and others, for Vico, represent a danger sign for all of European civilization, that we may be headed towards that decline once again. Well, there, I think, are some pretty profound implications to Vico's theory. Some of them are very important for subsequent practice of historical and anthropological research. Vico teaches us to read documents like Homer's Iliad not only as works of art, but as representations of a particular sort of mentality. Similarly, heraldic paraphernalia, etymology, philology are all sources for reconstructing a past worldview, a worldview whose mentality may be in many ways antithetical or contrary to our own. And as I've argued, this really is the basis for cultural history and anthropology to this day. Contra to Hobbes and Locke, Vico argues that political society is not the result of a social contract, but is in fact a result of an evolutionary process, albeit a rather slow one, from customs and mores rather than from abstract rationality. And again, we come back to that critical notion that it's really faith and superstition which serves as the ultimate glue that holds society together. And this, again, we'll find repeated by such conservatives as Burke, most notably. And I think this is probably the most important point to conclude with, which is that while philosophic criticism and speculation might be the real ultimate fruit of high civilization, it's a poisonous fruit in that it dissolves the irrational and customary and religious beliefs that allow cultures and societies to develop and to cohere. And in this way, Vico is establishing an important precedent for subsequent anti-moderns. And this is a theme we'll find in almost all of the critics of the Enlightenment, that they are forced to deploy the techniques of the Enlightenment itself to argue against it. So as Vico deploys his new science of history to undermine skepticism, Berkeley will deploy empiricism to undermine naturalism, and Rousseau will deploy social contractarianism to undermine growing urbanism. Having said this, Vico does represent, I think, one of the most important challenges within the Enlightenment, and in some ways, a trajectory of interpretation which remains important for us even to this day.